Welcome back to Magical Academic Note Taking. And today we are digging into lesson 4. This is the last component of the academic scaffolding, which is creating the framework within which you will think and write and eventually reach your output of your thesis, dissertation, or academic journal paper. This today is the introduction to Smart Notes, and our lesson goals for today is to learn the basic features of Smart Note taking. So, welcome. I've included this introduction to Smart Notes as part of the academic scaffolding section because although the Smart Notes process runs throughout the 4 session processes, there are a few basics of the ideas of Smart Notes in general that I would like to review before we begin. I've come to believe that implementing a Smart Notes process into your research and writing, in fact, into your whole life, is the key to academic success of any kind. So, note taking, the collection, curation, and synthesizing of notes is, in my opinion, one of the most important activities that you will undertake in pursuit of your PhD or, in fact, any other academic endeavor. Without a smart note taking process, you will struggle to uncover research gaps, synthesize your ideas, support any arguments, etc. And I would go so far to say that without Rome research and the technical possibilities that it presents, you wouldn't be able to make your smart notes so magical. I know this because I was looking desperately for something like Rome research during the first year of my PhD, and unfortunately, it didn't actually exist yet. And I'd even gone so far as to meet with a software company to discuss my ideas for building something which would have been far inferior to what Rome gives us today. Once you master and implement your own note taking process, I feel really confident in promising you that your entire academic experience will become much more fun. A Smart Notes process gives you a fluid continuation, building up momentum that carries you through from the moment you pick up the book right through to handing in your output. So let's talk about the origin of this term, Smart Notes. Most of what I'm about to tell you today, and in fact, the rest of the course, is based on Sonka Aaron's book called How to Take Smart Notes. I have included it in the reading and resources list. If you haven't read it, it's definitely a worthwhile read. Even if you take this course, there are things that you're going to learn from the book that might add and improve to your own personalized process. This text is actually written for academics, but it's useful to anyone who really wants to write, to think, to connect ideas, or just to become like a really interesting person. So all of the information in this lesson is based on the book. It really opened my eyes. The process that we will learn here over the next over the 4 working sessions is modified for Rome research and my own discoveries about how smart notes work for me. But the basics are all from this book. So Aaron's approach to note taking comes from researching a 20th century German sociologist called Niklas Luhmann. You probably have heard his name before if you are in the Rome arena, because Luhmann is responsible for developing the very first Zettelkasten system. The word Zettelkasten is actually a German word for slip box, which is the word that Sonka Arens uses within his book. And a slip box is basically a collection of cards organized by topic and their own relationships with the other cards, but it's done manually. So not easy, very, very difficult. The basis of both Arens and Lerman's approach to note taking is the understanding that notes themselves, individual notes themselves, are useless when read outside of the context from which they come and when read without any related relationships. What gives a note value, what makes a note smart, is understanding the context from which it was taken, as well as establishing very clearly its relationship to other notes and ideas that were generated from making these connections within notes. So I always think of smart notes in the context of a pond. So imagine you have a really deep and muddy pond. If you have an idea and you throw it into that pond, it will sink to the bottom into the mud and you will never find it again. But if you create a net of ideas by linking them all together, that net will float on top of the pond, and when you throw in your idea, your net will it will land on top of the rest of the net, and your note will be there interconnected, waiting within the context in which it was written and ready for when you need it. So we will be building this net. We will be using a regular and disciplined process so that you will never lose a single note to the swamp. So, what are smart notes? Let's first talk about what smart notes are not. Smart notes are not separated from their source context. So smart notes are not written on a post-it note somewhere and stuck to your desk so that you can find it a few weeks later and you have no idea where it came from. Smart notes are not a highlighted quote in isolation. And we've all done this. I've done it multiple times. We've sped through a book, highlighted all of the sections that look good, and then gone back to read them and had absolutely no idea what it meant to you at the time that you highlighted. And Aaron says, and this is a direct quote, even doctoral students sometimes just collect decontextualized quotes from a text, which is probably the worst possible approach to research imaginable. So congratulations me. I was approaching research in the worst possible way when I started. Smart notes are also not notes that you took 3 months or 3 days ago that exist anywhere but your Rome database. So when you follow the processes that we are about to establish, every single note you take will end up in Rome research within a day of you taking it, normally, hopefully, the same day. I don't know about you, but prior to reading Aaron's book, I didn't have any notes that didn't fit in at least one of these categories. So if smart notes aren't separated from context, if they're not a highlighted quote in isolation, and if they aren't notes that exist outside of your Rome graph, what exactly are they? Let's talk about what smart notes are. When I'm laser focused on a source, there are two conditions that are difficult to replicate when I revisit these notes later on during the synthesizing or the writing process. Number one is the context. When I'm reading and something I read stands out to me, it stands out to me because I am reading within that specific context. And when I pull that quote out of the context and take it as an isolated note, I can no longer make the connections I made that told me, that made my brain tell me that this was something important for me to write down. The second thing that is very difficult to replicate is that buzz of connection. So when you're ensconced in a deep work reading session, your brain is hyper focused on that idea at hand. So, in that moment of buzz, you will make connections with other ideas and generate new ones in the moments that you are reading. A smart note lives within your graph, and a smart note must replicate both of these conditions. And that's part of what we are going to learn to make sure that every note in Rome Research is sitting within its context and has that same sort of element of buzz that allows you to make relationship connections and idea connections. You will make sure that these smart notes have those two elements by implementing the processes that we're about to learn. So, what again are smart notes? This this comes from this next section, structural, conceptual, and dialectical, comes from a pretty classic book called How to Read a Book by Adler and Van Duren. And that again is linked in the reading and resources. What's interesting about these three elements is that they link directly to our sessions that we're going to define as we move forward. So, smart notes are structural. Smart notes are always connected to their source context. You know exactly where they came from and what was the context was surrounding that note that made it important to you. These kinds of notes are uncovered during your inspectional reading, and we will cover inspectional reading during both the collect and the curate sessions of our 4 sessions. Smart notes are conceptual, meaning they are presented in your own words. And we will uncover those kinds of notes when you are doing your analytic and active reading, which happens when you are collecting notes, usually at some level, but happens at a deeper level during the synthesize session. So we're going to talk about that then. And SMART notes are dialectical. They are reviewed, categorized, and linked to possible future usage. The magic question you always ask yourself in Rome is, when will I need to see this again? And when you answer that question, you're making your SMART notes magic. These dialectical notes are uncovered during your synoptic reading, which happens while you are synthesizing and also while you are creating. So, what are the basics of smart note taking? What we are talking about now is just the things that you need to think about before we get to the actual nuts and bolts of collection. If you are taking notes before you get to the next lesson, think about these things because these are the things that you will always do when you are taking smart notes. So, the first thing you will do is you will read with a pen in hand. So, as you'll see when we get to the nuts and bolts of the collection process, it might actually not always be a pen, but the principle remains the same. Always have a way to add your own thoughts to a note at all time. Never read without the intention of also writing. So that means you need to think about how you set yourself up, right? Never read without the intention of also writing. Do you have a pen? Do you have a laptop nearby? Do you have, a trusty little brown notebook that you carry with you like I do? So again, just highlighting, a highlighter does not count as a pen, okay? Can I say that again? A highlighter does not count as a pen. Highlighting other people's thoughts is just not enough. Reading will generate your own thoughts, and you must write them down. As Sonka Aran says all the time, thinking is no use unless you get it out of your head. So there's no point in, you're not going to make huge leaps and bounds just from thinking while you're reading. You must be writing while you are reading. So does this mean that you never highlight a quote? No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that you'll never highlight a quote in isolation and bring that into your room. You might. You may recognize something in the quote or the paraphrase, or maybe that thought just tickles at your brain, but you can't quite get there in making a connection, but you know that it might be important. That's fine. We have many more steps with which to squeeze the magic out of that specific note. And if it doesn't have magic for you in the end, there's no harm done. Rome has plenty of room to hold that thought for you in case somehow it becomes serendipitously useful in the future, which again is the magic of Rome. Think first. And the question you always need to ask yourself is, why am I writing this down? If you ask yourself the question, why am I writing this down? You are going to immediately generate further thoughts about what it is that you are reading, and you are going to document why you are writing it down. So that's really important as a question you always ask yourself. Reference your context. So remember, obviously, to always include your page number. The overall context that we will be collecting our notes in will always be the source, and our process captures that. But what about the rest of the paragraph uh, that the note sits in? What about the preceding or the following paragraph? Did they contain information that is important to the context and will inform you in the future? At best, if you misunderstand the context, you'll use it, you'll guess at the context, and you'll get it wrong. At worst, if you misunderstand the context, you'll end up misconstruing the quote completely, and you could jeopardize your entire research. So when you take a note, don't just take a note out of its context without first considering, do I need everything surrounding it? And again, if you are taking notes using the processes that we are going to present, that's not going to be a big deal for you to try and capture and keep. A smart note means you have added your own clear, concise note to the note that you took. And we're going to curate and synthesize what you write later on in the process. But for right now, you should write a clear, concise note, including answering the question, why am I writing this down? But also anything else that pops into your head. Like I said, it's okay if you have a few standalone quotes, but for 90% of your notes, you should be undertaking this step. Ask yourself the question, why did I write this down? What does this mean in your own words? What connection did it force you to make? What ideas did reading this generate? And again, we clean all this up as part of the process, but it's essential to start doing this now while you are taking notes so that, again, you don't miss those two conditions of context and buzz that we discussed earlier. We're going to be talking a lot about blocks. Block referencing is one of the most exciting and powerful things you have available to you in Rome research. So, getting good at blocks and understanding the power of nested relationships and outlining is a key part of this course. So, as you start taking notes, you can help yourself in the future by saying to yourself, I only want to include one idea per block. So, when you take a note, make it atomic. Make it one single idea on a single line. And if you have another idea, just skip a line and write it on a separate block so that it can replicate what it's going to look like within Rome research. This will become more and more important as we move forward. So, practice makes perfect. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this is really going to slow me down. And yes, it will, because every time you read something interesting, you're stopping to think about it and write something down in your own words. But the reading that you take in and note will then have quality over quantity. I mean, think about it. There's no point in racing through a book, highlighting practically every note that looks interesting and then having nothing usable at the end, and even worse, having nothing usable at the end when you after you've read through something 100 times before you realize that the notes you've taken are useless. So taking notes any other way than taking smart notes is just a waste of your time. So when you take your time and you gather these strong quality atomic notes, you will be using these to actually build up your draft eventually after we've processed them. So when you're buzzing along on an active idea, and the understanding of what you want to say is clearer, that's the time to write down your thoughts and write down your notes. When you're sitting down to actually synthesize the notes, that buzz will be gone. So it's important to practice so we can carry that buzz through. You won't be good at this in the beginning. You'll slip back to your old ways. You'll get frustrated. You want to throw your book across the room, but just don't get hung up on that you're not going to be good. I'm still not good at it. It takes practice. Just keep these ideas of what a smart note is, the basics of smart note taking, in the forefront of your mind, and you will continue to get better and better. There there are different methods that work for different people. So maybe Smart Notes in the way that I have just presented them to you would drive you crazy taking them that way. There are other ways to do it. You could read through a journal article once for yourself and then go back and read through again and take notes. So taking notes on the second read through, that works. And also, let's talk about handwritten notes. There is a Sanka Aran quote that says, handwritten notes are more valuable than typed notes when it comes to understanding. Slowing down the writing slows down the processing and forces you to understand. End quote. Sometimes when I'm struggling, a lot of what we're going to learn is digital note taking. So, a lot of times when I'm struggling, I step away from my digital note taking and I actually pick up a pen because I think through a pen. So, make sure you always have a trusty little notebook with you and always, always read with a pen in hand. So, in summary, there is a lot more to the Smart Notes process and how it works, but a smart, robust note taking process is the key to academic success. The process that we will learn in this course is based on the Zettelkasten method as presented by Sanka Arons in the book How to Take Smart Notes. So again, it doesn't hurt if you want to pick that book up and read it. You could do it after the course if you want. Read with a pen in hand, put notes in your own words, keep your notes in context, jot down your ideas, all while you are reading. Okay? The course in action. Start taking your notes the smart way. Just start today. Once you've watched this lesson, put something down, go pick up a journal article and just practice and see how it works for you. Um, in the next lesson, we'll be reviewing different methods of collection, as well as exactly how to get your notes into Rome neatly and cleanly. But for now, just focus on changing your note-taking habits into smart note-taking habits. So, what's next? Next, we are going into our very, very first deep work process bucket. We have collect, curate, synthesize, and write. And in the next lesson, we are going to talk about collection. That's it for now. Onwards and upwards. See you next time.